Tonight, we are going to follow the slow rise, the long silence, and the impossible rediscovery of a city that was carved rather than built. A city whose walls were the mountain itself. For centuries, the outside world was so certain it had vanished that its very existence became a kind of rumor traded among Bedouin storytellers around desert fires. Somewhere in the Red Hills south of the Dead Sea, they said, there was a place where the cliffs opened into rooms, where columns stood in the living rock, and where an old people, wealthier than kings, had built a treasury and then walked away. The name of that place, when it was finally spoken again in a European tongue, was Petra. And the story of how it was found, and how it was lost, and how it came to be there in the first place, is one of the strangest quiet tales the ancient world has left us. Before we begin, take a moment to leave a like on this video, and to subscribe if you find comfort in the long, slow stories told here. It costs nothing, and it helps other sleepless travelers stumble onto this quiet corner of the internet in the small hours when they need it most. And while you are settling in, drop your location and your local time down in the comments. There is a particular peace in knowing who else in the world is lying awake tonight, listening to the same voice, drifting toward the same distant place. Now, dim the light if it is not already dim. Let your shoulders come down away from your ears. Let the day you have carried drop off your back like a heavy cloak and get comfortable. You are about to walk into a canyon in the desert, and the walls of that canyon will close over you, and inside them a whole civilization is waiting. Our story begins not with a king, not with a hero, and not with a war. It begins with a road, and with the people who had the patience to sit beside it. Picture, if you can, the enormous wedge of land we call the Arabian Peninsula, roughly around the year 400 BC. To the west lies the Red Sea. To the east, the Persian Gulf. In between stretches an ocean of stone and sand, veined with wadis, which is the Arabic word for the dry riverbeds that flood once or twice a year and then vanish again into cracked earth. This is not empty land. It is only empty of the things city dwellers know how to see. It is full of small clans moving from well to well, of camels bred to walk for days without water, and of goods, extraordinary goods, moving in slow, patient trains from one end of the desert to the other. The most valuable of those goods, in that century and for many centuries before and after, was not gold, not silver, not iron. It was two kinds of hardened tree sap, frankincense and myrrh. Both grew on gnarled little trees that thrived in only one or two corners of southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa. Both, when scored with a knife, wept a milky resin that dried into pale gold beads. And both, when burned, sent up a smoke so fragrant that every civilization of the ancient Mediterranean, from Egypt to Babylon to Greece to Rome, believed it was the correct way to speak to a god. Temples burned it by the ton. Funerals required it. Royal households were scented with it. The Roman Empire at its height was so addicted to frankincense that a single emperor is said to have burned an entire year's supply of Arabia in a single afternoon, in mourning for his dead wife. And every gram of it, every last bead, had to come out of the desert on the back of a camel. That is where our people enter the story. They were called the Nabateans, and where they came from before the historians noticed them is genuinely unclear. They spoke a form of Aramaic, wrote in a script that would eventually become the ancestor of Arabic writing, and gave their gods names that echo across the ancient Near East. But their origins are wrapped in the same kind of haze that hangs over most nomad peoples, because nomads do not build cities that archaeologists can dig up, and they do not leave the paper trail that scribes on the Nile or in Mesopotamia left behind. What we know is that by roughly the 4th century BC, they had settled into a stretch of country in what is today southern Jordan, and they had noticed something that changed everything for them. The great caravan road that carried the frankincense north from the fields of Yemen and Oman had to pass, almost inevitably, through the mountains they lived in. And whoever controlled those mountains controlled the price of prayer for half the known world. The country they lived in was, on first inspection, one of the worst possible places to build any kind of civilization. It was a landscape of towering sandstone cliffs streaked pink and red and orange, cut by narrow canyons that flooded suddenly and violently when the winter rains came. It rained perhaps 4 inches a year if the year was kind. There were no rivers, There were no lakes. The nearest reliable water was a day's walk in any direction, and even that was seasonal. If you had wanted to design a piece of earth on which no city could ever stand, you could hardly have improved on the region the Nabateans chose. And yet they chose it, and they thrived in it, because they had understood a secret that took the rest of the world a very long time to catch up with. The desert does not lack water. It lacks the patience and the engineering to catch water when it comes. Every winter, for a few short weeks, storms would sweep in from the Mediterranean, and rain would fall on the high country in sheets. The wadis that had been dust for 11 months would fill in an hour and become raging brown torrents, tearing loose boulders and drowning any animal caught in the wrong canyon. Then the storm would move on, and within a day or two at most, the water would be gone, absorbed into the sand, evaporated into the sky, poured uselessly into salt lakes that killed anything that drank from them. The desert wasted its own gift, and the Nabateans, over generations of watching, decided to stop letting it. What they built underneath their eventual city is one of the most quietly impressive feats of engineering in the ancient world, and we will spend real time with it in a later section, because it deserves that time. For now, understand only this. They learned to read the shape of every canyon, every slope, every hidden fold in the rock. They learned to see where the water wanted to go before it went there, and to be waiting for it with cisterns cut into the stone, with channels chiseled along cliff faces, with dams sunk quietly into the throats of side wadis. They learned to catch the flood and hold it, drop by careful drop, and to release it through ceramic pipes that ran for miles under their feet. They turned a country that could not feed a family of goats into a country that would eventually feed tens of thousands of people, and they told almost nobody how they did it. Their water systems were state secrets. The location of a hidden cistern in a lonely wadi could mean the difference between life and death for a caravan, and only the guides knew which stones covered which reservoirs. It was, in the most literal sense, a civilization built on the ability to keep a secret about water. And so the Nabateans sat at the crossroads of the world's most valuable trade, in the middle of a country that everyone else believed to be uninhabitable, drinking from stone jars that they alone knew how to fill. The caravans of frankincense and myrrh, moving north out of Arabia toward the ports of the Mediterranean and the temples of Egypt and beyond, had to pass through their hills. They needed water, they needed guides, they needed protection from raiders, some of whom in the earliest days were probably the same Nabateans wearing a different face. And the Nabateans, being sensible, offered all of it for a price. At first, they seem to have been paid in kind, in goods rather than coin. A caravan handing over a percentage of its bales of incense in return for a filled water skin and a safe night's camp. Later, as their operation grew more sophisticated, they took payment in silver, and later still they minted their own coinage, stamped with the faces of their kings. But that is running ahead of the story. In the 4th century BC, they were still what they had always been, a people of tents and camels and hidden wells, a people whose wealth was not yet visible from the outside, because they did not spend it on anything a passing conqueror could see. And that invisibility, in that particular century, was about to save their lives. The reason invisibility was about to save the Nabateans is that a young man from a small kingdom in northern Greece had just walked out of the mountains of his homeland and set about conquering the entire eastern half of the known world. His name was Alexander, and by the year 331 BC, he had shattered the Persian Empire, marched into Egypt, been crowned pharaoh, and turned his eyes toward every remaining kingdom that had ever received tribute from the Persians. Among those kingdoms, in a very small way, were the frankincense lands of Arabia, and among the peoples who profited from them were, of course, our nomads with their hidden cisterns. Alexander did not live long enough to reach them personally. He died in Babylon in 323 BC at the age of 32, of fever or poison or exhaustion, depending on which ancient source you believe, and his enormous empire cracked apart in the hands of his generals almost before his body was cold. Two of those generals matter for our story. One was Ptolemy, who took Egypt and founded a dynasty there that would last 300 years and end with Cleopatra. The other was a man named Antigonus, who tried to hold the Asian portion of the empire together and failed, but not before making the first recorded attempt in history to conquer the Nabateans. That attempt is the moment our nomads step out of the shadows and into the written record for the first time, and the way they emerge tells you everything about who they were. The account we have was written by a Greek historian named Hieronymus, who was actually present in the region as an administrator, and it survives because a later writer named Diodorus Siculus copied it into his enormous history of the world. It is, by ancient standards, an unusually reliable window into a first meeting between two very different peoples. Antigonus, in 312 BC, sent one of his officers, a man named Athenaeus, with a force of about 4,000 foot soldiers and 600 cavalry, to raid the Nabateans. His intelligence was excellent. He had learned that once a year the Nabateans gathered at a certain rocky stronghold in the mountains for a festival, and that during that festival they left their women, their children, their old people, and their accumulated wealth behind while the fighting men went off to trade. Athenaeus timed his march to arrive at the stronghold when it was thinly defended. He marched by night, covered the distance in 3 days, arrived at dusk, stormed the place, killed the guards he found, took the treasure and the captives he wanted, and turned around for home. On paper it was a perfect raid. Fast, surgical, profitable. He camped that night about 20 miles away, congratulating himself, and posted only a light watch because he believed he had gotten clean away. He had not. The Nabateans had scouts of their own, and by dawn they had gathered 8,000 men from across the desert, tracked the raiders back to their camp, and fallen on them in the darkness while they slept. Nearly the entire Greek force was killed. Athenaeus himself died in the confusion. A handful of horsemen escaped, wounded, to carry the news back. The Nabateans, once they had recovered their people and their goods, sent a letter to Antigonus in careful Aramaic, complaining that they had done him no harm and asking why he had attacked a peaceful people. Antigonus, embarrassed, wrote back a soothing reply blaming the whole business on Athenaeus acting without orders and promised it would not happen again. And then, because he was a Macedonian general and his word was worth roughly what such things were usually worth, he immediately organized a second, larger expedition under his own son Demetrius. Demetrius was a more careful commander than Athenaeus, and he had 4,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, and he moved into Nabatean territory with the full intention of finishing the job his father had failed to finish. But the Nabateans had learned the shape of him from the first attempt. They did not gather in one place this time. They scattered their families and their flocks into the deep desert, into hiding places that only they knew how to find, and they placed lookouts on the high rocks. When Demetrius arrived, he found the country empty of anything worth taking. He besieged a stronghold, probably the same one Athenaeus had raided, and found it now properly defended and impossible to storm. And then he received a delegation of Nabatean elders who spoke to him with what the Greek historian records as a remarkable, plain-spoken dignity. "We live in this country," they said in effect, "because it is not worth conquering. We have no fields you can burn, no cities you can sack, no harbors you can blockade. Our wealth is what we can carry, and we have carried it away. Take the strongholds if you can. You will find only stones. Take our water if you can. You will find only what we have hidden. We do not want a war with you. We only want to live the life our fathers lived. If you press us, we can retreat further into the desert than any army of yours can follow. If you leave us in peace, we can be your friends, and our caravans can bring you goods that come from lands your ships cannot reach." Demetrius, who was intelligent enough to recognize a lecture from geography itself when he heard one, negotiated a face-saving withdrawal, took some hostages and some gifts, and went home. The Nabateans went back to their tents, and for the next 250 years, no foreign army seriously attempted to conquer them because the lesson had been widely absorbed. This was a people whose greatest strength was the willingness to disappear. What the Greek accounts of that first encounter also tell us, and this is the piece I love most, is what Nabatean life actually looked like before the great cities and the carved facades and the silks and the coinage. Hieronymus describes them as living without houses, without agriculture, and without wine. They planted no crops. They drank only water. They passed a law, he says, on pain of death, that no member of their people should ever plant grain or ever build a house of stone. The reason is beautiful in its logic. A field of grain and a stone house are things you cannot pick up and carry. They are hostages you have given to the earth and to any army that happens to march through. A person with no field and no house can walk away from any invader in the world and cannot be starved out or burned out. It was a whole civilization organized around the principle of never giving anyone anything worth taking. And when they did eventually break that principle and begin to build in stone, they built in a way no invader could ever burn down, because they built into stone that already was there. But that is still ahead of us. In the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, the Nabateans were still nomads, still living in tents, and their gathering place among the red cliffs was not yet a city. It was a fortress and a market. A place where the caravans stopped, where water was doled out, where deals were struck, and where, once a year, the whole scattered people came in from the desert to see one another and to bury their dead. That gathering place had a name in their own language which we do not fully know, though later inscriptions call the region and the city Rakhmu. The Greeks, hearing the name of the rocky country around it, gave it their own name, from the Greek word for rock, and that is the name that has stuck to it through every century since. Petra, the rock. It is not the name of a city. It is a description of what was there instead of a city, and the Nabateans in time would turn that description into an address. The 2 centuries after the failed invasions of Antigonus and Demetrius were the great quiet growth of the Nabatean world. There are almost no dramatic stories to tell from that period, because the Nabateans, wisely, did not attempt any drama. What they did instead was extend their grip along the incense road, north into Syria, south into the Hijaz, west into the Sinai, east toward the Persian Gulf. They set up watering stations at intervals of a day's camel march. They stationed troops at critical passes. They built relationships with the frankincense producers in southern Arabia, buying at the source and setting the prices at which the resin left the desert. They took over rival caravan routes by the simple method of offering better service and better security. And their kings, when they finally began to call themselves kings, adopted the throne name Aretas, which is the Greek version of a Nabatean word meaning something like the pleasing one or the excellent one, and which 4 different kings of Petra would wear across the next 3 centuries. The first Aretas we hear of appears in a Jewish document of all places. In the year 169 BC, during the persecutions of the Jewish people by the Greek king Antiochus IV, a Jewish high priest fled south to escape assassination and took refuge, the book of 2nd Maccabees tells us, with a certain Aretas, the tyrant of the Arabs. The word tyrant in Greek at that time did not necessarily mean cruel. It meant a ruler who held power without being a hereditary Greek-style monarch, which is exactly what Aretas would have been in the eyes of the world. It is a small notice, easy to miss, but it is the first time our nomads have a king with a name in the historical record, and it means that by the middle of the 2nd century BC, the loose confederation of desert clans had hardened into a kingdom with a court and a diplomacy and a capital where deposed foreign priests could hide in safety. The rock was becoming a place. By the 1st century BC, the transformation was well underway. The Nabateans were still, in their souls, a people of the desert. Their kings still bore war names that meant things in Aramaic rather than Greek. Their gods were still their own gods. Their script was still their own script. But their treasury was now full of Roman silver and Egyptian gold, and Greek craftsmen were arriving in the canyons to teach them how to carve the local sandstone in ways the local sandstone had never dreamed of being carved. The Nabateans were about to spend 2 generations doing something no other Arab people had ever done, and would not do again for many centuries. They were going to take the wealth of the world's incense trade, and they were going to spend it on stone. Not stone piled up into buildings, but stone hollowed out into rooms. The cliffs of Petra were about to open. Before we walk into those opening cliffs, take a slow breath and let yourself settle a little deeper. The story is not going anywhere. We have all night, and the caravans move slowly. Let the room around you soften at the edges. Let the weight of your head press gently into the pillow. We are going to spend this section looking at the country itself, the country the Nabateans chose, because until you understand the shape of it, you cannot understand why what they did there was miraculous. Imagine that you have joined a caravan coming north out of Arabia along the frankincense road sometime around the year 60 BC. You have been walking for weeks. Behind you lies the great inland desert, a plain of black gravel and drifting sand under a sky so bright it hurts to look at. Your camels are laden with bales of resin, and with silks brought overland from India through the port cities of Yemen, and with pepper, and with pearls, and with the small carved seals that merchants used to sign their letters. You are tired, and your water is low, and the guide at the head of the column has been promising for 2 days that soon you will come to the great market of the north, where the Nabateans hold court, and where you can rest, and drink, and sell. The country changes as you go. The sand gives way to gravel, and the gravel gives way to broken rock, and the horizon, which has been flat for so long that you had almost forgotten what a shape was, begins to rise. Low bare hills at first, the color of old bone, then higher ridges, streaked with rust and iron. Then, on the 4th or 5th day out from the last well, something that looks impossible. A wall of red mountains rising sheer from the desert floor, glowing in the late afternoon light as if they had been cast in copper. This is the range the geographers now call the Shara, and it runs like a spine along the eastern edge of a great crack in the earth called the Rift Valley, which reaches from Syria all the way down through the Red Sea and into Africa. The rock of that spine is Nubian sandstone, laid down as sediment more than 500 million years ago, and then lifted and tilted and carved by wind and rain into cliffs 1,000 feet high, banded through with iron oxides and manganese and copper that give it its extraordinary colors. Red, yes, but also pink and orange and cream and violet, and a sudden shocking blue where certain minerals stain the stone. The Nabateans, growing up in that country, saw those bands not as accidents but as decoration, as if the mountain had already been painted before they arrived. When they later began to carve the cliffs, they would leave the natural banding visible in ceilings and walls, so that a chamber's roof might look like flowing water frozen in mid-current. Your caravan turns east, toward the mountains. There is no visible road. There does not need to be. The land itself funnels you into a single approach, up a wide, dry wadi flanked by lower hills, and then into a narrow one, and then into a narrower one still. You pass small square structures cut from the local stone, watchtowers, the guide tells you, though they look more like tombs. You pass a spring, walled and covered with a low stone dome, and a Nabatean man in a long striped robe waves your camels to a trough where he has already drawn water. He does not ask for payment. Not yet. The reckoning will come later, when you have reached the city and settled with the market officials. He is here because the king of Petra has decided that no caravan should reach his capital thirsty, and that decision, small as it seems, is why the caravans keep coming even when other routes would be shorter. Reliable kindness is a competitive advantage. You leave the spring and continue. The valley narrows again. And now you come to a place where the cliffs seem to close entirely, where the only way forward is through a crack in the rock so tight that at first you cannot believe your camel will fit. This is the entrance to Petra proper, and its Arabic name today is the Sik, which simply means the shaft. It is not a crack in the ordinary sense. It is a fissure that runs for more than a kilometer through the heart of the mountain, formed originally when tectonic forces split the sandstone open long before human beings existed, and then polished for millennia by the flash floods that came screaming down it every winter. In some places, it is only 3 or 4 meters wide. Overhead, the walls rise 200 meters or more, so close together in places that you can see only a narrow ribbon of sky. The rock changes color as you walk. Deep red, then rose, then salmon, then a warm honey where the sunlight bounces from wall to wall and paints the stone with reflected fire. Your voices, without your meaning to, drop to a whisper. Your camel's hooves click on the paved stone because the paved stone is there. The Nabateans laid the floor of this canyon with fitted flagstones so that the caravans would not slip, and along the walls at waist height they carved channels for water. On the left wall, a ceramic pipeline runs almost the whole length of the Sik, buried in the rock, bringing fresh spring water down into the city. On the right wall, an open channel catches any runoff and diverts it into cisterns. You will pass these features without noticing them because they were designed to be invisible. That is the Nabatean way. Their engineering is meant to look like nature, and only when you learn to see it does it appear. At intervals along the walls, small niches have been carved, some with figures inside them, some empty. These are shrines, dedicated to gods whose names most travelers do not know. Dashara, the great god of the Nabateans, whose name means Lord of the Shara, of the mountains you have just passed through. Al-Azza, his consort, associated with the morning star. Al-Qutba, a god of writing and commerce. The Nabateans, like most peoples of the ancient world, believed that a journey was a sacred act, and that anyone entering a holy place should mark the passage with a nod or a small offering to the powers that own the ground. So the caravan pauses now and then, and men touch their foreheads to certain rocks, and small stones are placed at the feet of certain niches, and the procession moves on. Somewhere overhead, unseen but present, a Nabatean archer stands at a hidden lookout with a horn, ready to blow it if the wrong sort of visitor comes down the canyon. Nothing enters Petra that its keepers do not want to enter. This has been the case for 200 years, and it will be the case for 200 more. You walk for perhaps half an hour. The canyon curves, then curves again, then curves once more, and just when you have begun to wonder whether it will ever open, it does something better than open. It reveals. Between two vertical walls of red rock, in a slice of view no wider than a doorway, you catch a first glimpse of what everyone who has ever come here has caught a first glimpse of. A pale pink facade, delicately carved with columns and pediments and figures, standing perfectly still at the end of the corridor of stone, as if it had been placed there for the sole purpose of being seen exactly like this. As you walk on, more of it is revealed, section by section, until at last the sick gives out entirely and you step into a small open square, and the facade rises before you in full, 30 meters high, carved directly out of the living cliff, and looking, for all the world, as if a Greek temple had grown out of the mountain rather than been built against it. The Arabs of the region, many centuries later, would call this facade al-Khazne, which means the treasury. They would call it that because they came to believe, from a legend they told each other, that inside the great stone urn at the top of the upper story, a pharaoh had hidden a treasure of gold, and if you shot at the urn with a rifle, you might crack it open and shower yourself with wealth. The urn is still up there today, and if you look closely you can see the pockmarks from centuries of hopeful bullets, and if you look closer still you can see that the urn is solid stone, and there was never anything inside it. It is not a treasury. It never was. What it almost certainly is, though the archaeologists are still cautious about saying so, is a tomb. A royal tomb, carved for one of the greatest of the Nabatean kings, who we will meet properly in our next section, along with his queen and his family, and whose bones may still lie somewhere in the empty chambers behind that famous face. Take a moment to hold that image. The facade rises in 3 main tiers. 6 great columns run across the lower story, with a broad triangular pediment above them. The upper story is more elaborate, broken in the middle by a small round temple with a conical roof, flanked by 2 half pediments. Between the columns, delicate figures have been carved, some now weathered almost smooth, but originally showing gods and dancers and animals in fine relief. The whole surface, when it was first cut, was probably plastered smooth and painted in bright colors, so that what you and I see today as a pink monument was in its own time a riot of red and blue and gold. Time has stripped it back to its stone, and time was probably kinder to it that way. The colors would have been beautiful, but the naked rock, in all its natural banding, is more beautiful still. Behind the facade, the actual tomb is almost disappointing. A single large square chamber cut back into the cliff, perhaps 12 meters on a side, with 2 smaller side chambers and no decoration at all. Bare walls, a stone floor, a ceiling of banded rock. The Nabateans, like the Egyptians before them and like many people since, spent all their effort on the outside of a tomb, on the face the world would see, and left the inside plain because the inside was only for the dead, and the dead do not need columns. What matters is that you have stepped through the doorway and you are now inside the mountain. And outside the little square where your caravan is unloading 100 other travelers are doing the same. And above you, unseen from where you stand, the whole rest of the city is waiting. The treasury is only the doormat. Petra itself lies beyond. To understand what lies beyond that doormat, we should meet the man who most likely commissioned it. His name was Aratas IV, and he ruled the kingdom of the Nabateans for 48 years, from around 9 BC to 40 AD, which makes him one of the longest reigning monarchs of the ancient world. If Petra has a single face behind its many faces, that face is his. Almost every great monument you see there today, and almost every carved cliff whose photograph you have ever glimpsed, was either commissioned in his lifetime or set in motion by policies that he began. He is the reason the city looks the way it looks, and he is also, by every measure the ancient world used, a man who understood how to be quietly, patiently, spectacularly successful. We know a fair amount about him, and we know it from three very different sources. The first is his coins, of which thousands survive. On them he calls himself, in careful Aramaic letters, Aratas, king of the Nabateans, lover of his people. That last phrase, lover of his people, is not something Roman emperors put on their coins. It is not something Greek kings put on their coins. It is a boast that only a small number of Near Eastern rulers ever made, and it suggests, if nothing else, that Aratas wanted to be remembered as a king whose people prospered under him. The archaeological record suggests he was telling the truth. His coins circulated as far as Rome and as far as the Persian Gulf, and they were minted in enormous quantities, which means his kingdom was moving genuine volumes of trade. The second source is a handful of Nabatean inscriptions carved into rocks all over the region, in which subjects of his mention his name when dedicating a tomb or a shrine or a well. From these we know the names of his two queens, Huldu and Shakalat, and of several of his children, and of the officials who worked for him. It is a small window, but it is honest. The third source, which is by far the most colorful and by far the least flattering, is the New Testament and the Jewish historian Josephus, both of whom mention Aratas in connection with a scandal that ended in war. The scandal is worth telling because it shows you the world Aratas was operating in. He had married one of his daughters, whose name has not survived, to a client king of the Romans in the region just west of the Nabatean lands, a man called Herod Antipas, one of the several sons of the more famous Herod the Great. Herod Antipas ruled Galilee and Perea, which is to say the area around the Sea of Galilee and the eastern bank of the Jordan River, and he was the man who, according to the Gospels, presided over the execution of John the Baptist. He was also, in the way of client kings, a man of great personal appetites, and on a visit to Rome he met and fell in love with Herodias, who was already married to his half-brother, and who was also, by another connection, his own niece. It was the kind of tangle that Herodian families specialized in. When Herod Antipas came home, he informed his Nabatean wife that he intended to divorce her and marry Herodias. The daughter of Aratas, being not only insulted, but also one Imagenes in some personal danger, sent word ahead through the desert and slipped away from Herod's court and made her way in stages back to her father in Petra. Aratas, when she arrived, listened to her story and said nothing publicly. He waited. He waited, in fact, for several years. This is one of the things that makes him such a striking figure. A lesser king or a Roman would have reached at once for the sword. Aratas reached for the calendar. He allowed the insult to age. He allowed Herod Antipas to become distracted by other problems, of which there were many, including a growing dispute over the border between their two territories. And then, at the moment Aratas judged best, around the year 36 AD, he sent an army across that border, met the forces of Herod Antipas in the field, and destroyed them so completely that Josephus tells us not a soldier of Herod's escaped. The old man in Petra, then in his 70s, had waited nearly a decade to answer an insult, and when he answered it in full. Herod Antipas complained to the Emperor Tiberius, who ordered a Roman legion to march against Aratas, but before the legion could arrive Tiberius died, and his successor Caligula had no interest in the quarrel, and the whole matter was quietly dropped. Aratas kept the territory he had taken. The daughter, presumably, kept her dignity. And the reputation of the Nabatean king as a man not to be provoked was written into the memory of the region for another generation. The Bible touches him too, in a small but memorable way. In the second letter to the Corinthians, the Apostle Paul, defending his own record as a missionary, lists the various dangers he has escaped, and mentions that in Damascus the governor under Aretas, the king was guarding the city, meaning to arrest him, and that he had to be lowered in a basket through a window in the wall to get away. That is our Aretas, the fourth. His name reaching, through the accident of a scriptural footnote, into the memory of every Christian in the world, though almost none of them, hearing it read aloud on a Sunday morning, realize they are hearing the name of the king who built the treasury. Now, back to the city he built. If you have stepped out of the treasury and walked forward, the canyon widens again, and you find yourself in a broader wadi, still enclosed by cliffs on both sides, but now perhaps 100 meters across. The cliffs around you are honeycombed with tombs. Not one or two, not a dozen, hundreds. Some are small and plain, single doorways cut into the stone at ground level, leading to a single chamber for a modest family burial. Others are grander, with elaborate carved facades of their own, though none quite matching the treasury for polish. There is a whole cliff face to your right, called today the Street of Facades, where perhaps 40 tombs are stacked and interleaved like the fronts of houses on a very narrow street. Look up, and there are more, cut into the higher rock, reached by staircases hacked out of the cliff. Look down, and beneath your feet the desert floor is paved. In some places, you can still see the ruts worn into the paving by centuries of Nabatean carts. Look up a side wadi, and you will see more tombs and more staircases, and on the higher ground, terraces where houses once stood. Houses of ordinary stone and timber, none of which survive intact today, because unlike the tombs they were built rather than carved, and time has not been kind to what was built. That is one of the most important things to grasp about Petra. The city you see today, the city everyone photographs, is a city of the dead. The Nabateans, for reasons of ideology or theology or simple practicality, chose to spend their most durable craft on their tombs. Their houses were flimsier, their palaces were flimsier, their marketplaces were flimsier, and all of that has largely vanished. What remains, after 2,000 years, is what they carved into stone, and most of what they carved into stone was where they meant to put their dead. It is as though a future civilization, walking through the ruins of a modern city, found only the mausoleum standing and had to reconstruct the entire life of the population from graveyards. Petra is, in that sense, one enormous cemetery, but it is also one enormous city, because a Nabatean tomb was not a lonely thing in a lonely field. It was a place where the family gathered on the anniversary of the death, and where feasts were held in the memory of the parent or the ancestor, and where the god of the dead was petitioned for the well-being of the living. Many of the tomb facades have niches for benches, and small rooms carved to one side where the mourners could recline and eat and drink. The city of the dead was, in the Nabatean imagination, only a slightly quieter neighborhood of the city of the living. The two were laced through one another, and you cannot understand one without the other. Walk a little further, past the Street of Facades, and the wadi opens out into what was clearly the heart of the town. On your left, the cliff face is dominated by an enormous theater, cut directly into the mountain, capable of seating some 7,000 spectators, with the higher rows of seats standing above the very tombs whose fronts the theater builders had, without visible embarrassment, sliced through. The Nabateans reused their own necropolis when they needed the space. On your right and ahead, the ground opens into a broader plain, and here, though almost nothing rises higher than a knee today, you can trace the plan of the civic center. There was a colonnaded street, its columns broken now, but their stumps still marking the line of the paving, running east and west. There were temples flanking it. The largest, called today the Qasr al-Bint, which means the castle of Pharaoh's daughter in the misleading Arabic name given to it long afterward, was in fact the great sanctuary of Dashara, the chief god of the Nabateans, and its walls, built of dressed stone rather than carved from the mountain, still stand to a respectable height. There was a market, there were fountains, there were public baths. There was, on the higher slopes, a garden complex fed by a pool nearly the size of a modern swimming pool, filled with water that Aretas IV had piped in from a spring several kilometers away, and stocked with fish in the middle of a desert as a gesture of imperial swagger, which we will look at more closely in a later section. Aretas IV ruled all of this. When he died, at some point around the year 40 AD, he was buried, most modern archaeologists believe, in the great tomb whose face is the treasury, or perhaps in another of the royal tombs that stand higher up in the cliffs, whose facades are also grand, but whose interiors, like the treasuries, have been stripped bare by centuries of robbers and reinterred generations. We cannot be entirely certain. What we can say is that under his reign, the city reached a peak of population, of wealth, and of architectural ambition that it would never quite reach again, and that when you stand in the wadi today and look up at the carved cliffs, you are looking, in most cases, at the personal handiwork of masons whose paymaster was the lover of his people. And how those masons hung themselves off those cliffs, with rope and chisel and no safety net at all, is the story we will turn to next. Let your body sink a little deeper into the bed. The masons are about to begin their work, and their work took decades. There is no hurry. Let the image build in your mind slowly, the way it would have built in the eyes of a Nabatean child, watching, from a courtyard in the valley, the small figures of men suspended halfway up a cliff face, chipping patiently at stone that had never before been touched by human hands. The first thing to understand about how the Nabateans carved their monuments is that they did it in a way that seems, on first hearing, to violate common sense. They carved from the top down. When you or I imagine building a great facade with columns and cornices and pediments, we imagine starting at the ground and working upward, laying one course of stone on top of another, so that at every stage we have solid ground beneath our feet and a stable structure to rest against. But the Nabateans were not building, they were subtracting. Their facades were not assembled, they were revealed. Somewhere inside the cliff, before they began, the finished shape already existed in the mason's mind, and the job was simply to remove all the rock that was not that shape. And if you are subtracting stone from a vertical wall, the sensible way to do it is from the top, because everything you cut away falls harmlessly to the ground, and because the finished portion above you never needs to be scaffolded from below. So imagine, on a morning around the year 20 BC, a party of Nabatean masons arriving at the base of the cliff that would in time bear the face of the treasury. The site had already been chosen with care. It had to be a section of cliff tall enough to hold the intended composition, uniform enough in the quality of its stone to allow fine carving, and ideally close to a place of ritual importance. This last stretch of the sick, where it opened into a small square, met all three requirements. The stone here was Nubian sandstone of the finer variety, with fewer of the harder ironstone bands that would blunt a chisel, and with a color that ran evenly from pink to salmon rather than shifting abruptly through the layers. The masons unrolled a plan, drawn probably on papyrus or on a wooden board, and they took up their instruments, which were not many. Iron chisels of several sizes, iron picks with narrow points, wooden mallets, plumb bobs on lines, and squares and compasses of the kind that any Greek craftsman would have recognized. That last detail matters, because the masons of Petra, though Nabatean in their loyalty, had been trained in the school of design that spread out from Alexandria and from the eastern Greek cities after Alexander's conquests. Their columns are Corinthian and Ionic. Their pediments are triangular in the Greek fashion. Their proportions follow rules that a Vitruvius could have written. And yet nothing quite like what they produced at Petra was ever produced anywhere in the Greek or Roman world, because the Greeks and Romans built their temples out of blocks. The Nabateans grew theirs out of a mountain. The first task was to prepare a working platform at the very top of the cliff. Masons climbed the mountain from the back, following goat paths and then rough staircases hacked as they went, and reached the crown of the rock face 130 feet above the canyon floor. There they cut a shallow trench along the intended line of the facade, marking its outer boundary. They drove wooden stakes into the trench and lashed to them a wooden platform, cantilevered out over the edge of the cliff so that men could stand on it and reach the stone below their feet. They anchored ropes to iron pins driven into the top of the rock, and they lowered themselves in loops of rope, sometimes seated on planks slung like swings, sometimes standing in stirrup-like footholds cut into the cliff a few meters below the working level. From these hanging platforms, they began to cut. They did not cut the finished facade first. They cut a rough shape, a great rectangular pocket carved back into the cliff, deep enough to hold the eventual composition. This process took years. The wall of the pocket was hacked back stroke by stroke, tons of stone at a time, and all of the rubble was allowed to fall to the canyon floor, where laborers hauled it away in baskets and used it as fill for the paving and for terrace walls elsewhere in the city. A single facade the size of the treasury may have required the removal of several thousand cubic meters of stone. There are no records of how many men worked on it, or for how long, but based on the volume of rock removed and the methods available, the whole project probably occupied a workforce of perhaps 100 masons and their assistants for something between 5 and 10 years. Which is to say, the men who began chipping at the top of the cliff may not have lived to see the bottom of it finished. It was work for a life, which perhaps is why so much of it was funerary. As the pocket was cut back deeper and deeper into the mountain, the masons began to leave certain areas untouched. They knew, from the plan drawn on the papyrus, where the columns of the upper story would stand. They knew where the pediments would rise. They knew where the small round temple would sit at the center of the second tier. So instead of cutting those areas away, they left the rock where it was and cut around it. What emerged over the years was a sort of shapeless mass of stone standing proud from the interior wall of the pocket. That mass, ugly and inarticulate, contained, still hidden inside it, all the fine architecture the finished monument would show. And now, at last, the masons could begin the true carving. They worked their way down. The uppermost pediment first, then the round temple, then the frieze, then the columns of the upper story, then the cornice, then the columns of the lower story, then the ground level itself. At every stage, they were working on stone that had never been separated from the mountain and would never be separated from the mountain. There were no joints. There were no seams. A column at the treasury is a single piece of stone continuous with the cliff behind it. If it cracks, it cannot be replaced. If it is measured a centimeter wrong, it cannot be adjusted. Everything had to be right the first time because everything was final, and it is very nearly all right. Modern surveyors have measured the facade with instruments the Nabateans could not have imagined, and found that the columns are of equal thickness to within a few millimeters, that the pediments are level to within tolerances that would satisfy a modern architect, and that the whole composition, though carved out of a wall that is not itself perfectly vertical, appears from the ground to be as regular as if it had been machined. This is the more impressive when you remember that the masons could not step back from their work and check it. They were dangling from ropes or crouched on scaffolds bolted into the cliff, and their perspective on their own carving was always the wrong one. To see their work properly, they had to trust the plan and check it with rulers and imagine what it would look like from the canyon floor. And when the last of the scaffolding came down, and the rope pins were pulled from the top of the cliff, and the last basket of rubble was carried away, they walked to the far side of the little square in the sick and looked back, and saw for the first time what they had made. The treasury is the most famous of these carved facades, but it is far from the only one. In the years around Aretas IV's reign, and the century or so on either side of him, the Nabateans produced hundreds of them. Some are tiny, no larger than a doorway, hacked out by a family of modest means for a modest burial. Some are enormous. The so-called royal tombs, cut into a cliff on the eastern side of the main city plaza, include the urn tomb, the silk tomb, the Corinthian tomb, and the palace tomb, the last of which is more than 50 meters wide and rises 3 stories, with an entire architectural composition of columns and doorways that seems to imitate the front of an actual Roman palace, as if the Nabatean king who commissioned it had said to his masons, "There is a building in Rome I will never visit. Carve it into my mountain, and I will lie behind it forever." The tomb they made is now weathered almost to a blur in places, and its top corners have crumbled where a particularly poor vein of sandstone gave way, but the size of the ambition is unmistakable. There is also the monastery, high on a mountain plateau above the city, reached by a staircase of some 800 steps cut into the rock, which is even bigger than the treasury and even simpler in its lines. Whether it was a tomb or a temple is still debated. What is certain is that a party of masons dragged their tools up 800 steps every morning for years, and did their work, and dragged their tools down again at night. Their skill went beyond the facades. Behind them lay chambers, and above them and beside them, all cut into the same continuous stone. In the finer tombs, the masons carved coffers into the ceilings and left ledges around the walls for the placement of grave goods, and cut small niches for oil lamps so that the family gathered inside would have light. Some ceilings, as I mentioned before, deliberately preserved the natural mineral banding of the rock, so that when you look up, you see the sandstone flowing across the roof like a slow river caught in mid-pour, ribbons of red and white and gold and violet, patterns no human hand could have designed, framed and displayed by human hands that had the wisdom to know when not to touch. In one chamber, in the tomb called the Silk Tomb, the ceiling looks so much like watered silk that the modern name of the whole monument was drawn from that single feature. You stand under it, and it seems impossible that stone could behave that way, and yet it does, because the mountain was already an artist before the masons ever arrived, and their finest achievement was often to know when to stop. The masons could not have hung from their ropes for a decade at a time, and the caravans could not have paused for weeks at a time, and the city could not have grown to house tens of thousands of people without one resource that a desert normally cannot provide: water. So we come now to the deepest and quietest achievement of the Nabateans, which is the one they never carved a facade for, because it lay under the ground, and which was the true reason a city could exist in that country at all. This section is going to move slowly through pipes and cisterns and dams, and if you drift off before the end of it, that is only right, because these systems were themselves designed to drift, drop by drop, from one basin to the next, and their whole genius was patience. Petra sits at a place where three quite different kinds of weather meet. To the west, the Mediterranean climate sends occasional winter rains, thin and irregular, that fall on the high mountains and run off quickly. To the east lies the true desert, dry for nearly the entire year. To the north, storm systems can sometimes bring more substantial rainfall in spring and autumn. The total precipitation over a Nabatean year averages perhaps 15 centimeters, which is to say a hand's width of water spread across the whole calendar. In a bad year, it might be half that. In a good year, twice. It is enough water, in theory, to sustain a small oasis. It is not enough water, on its face, to sustain a city of 20 or 30,000 people, along with their livestock, their gardens, their ritual pools, and the enormous seasonal population of caravan traders who camped outside the walls during trading season. The Nabateans did it anyway. They did it by treating every single raindrop that fell within a great catchment area of hundreds of square kilometers as a piece of state property, and by ensuring that not one of those drops reached the desert unless the city had first decided it was not needed. Their first tool was the cistern. A cistern, in the Nabatean sense, was a chamber cut into the rock, sealed with waterproof plaster, and positioned in a place where rainwater would naturally flow into it. In the simplest form, a cistern was carved directly beneath a smooth expanse of bare rock, called a catchment, which the masons had polished and sometimes deepened with channels to direct water toward a single small opening. Rain falling anywhere on the catchment was gathered by the channels and poured through the opening into the cistern below, where it was held cool and dark, safe from evaporation. A single family cistern of this kind might hold 10 or 20 cubic meters of water, which is enough for a household through the dry season. A public cistern might hold several hundred cubic meters, and the great civic reservoirs of Petra, some of which have been excavated in recent decades, held thousands. Archaeologists working in the hills around the city have mapped more than 200 such cisterns of various sizes, and they believe several hundred more still lie hidden, sealed and full, in places the Bedouin have known about for centuries but have kept, in the ancient Nabatean tradition, to themselves. The total storage capacity of the system, when it was operating at full efficiency, is estimated at around 40 million liters, enough to see the city through even a bad year. But storage was only half of the problem. Water sitting in a cistern is safe from evaporation, but it does you no good if it is sitting 3 kilometers away from the kitchen where you want to use it. The Nabateans solved that with a network of pipelines and channels that laced through the whole city and the surrounding hills like a hidden circulatory system. The most common carrier was the ceramic pipe. Fired in kilns in nearby villages, each pipe segment was a tapered cylinder about 40 centimeters long, designed so that the narrow end of one pipe fitted into the wide end of the next, and the joint was then sealed with lime mortar. Miles of such pipelines have been traced in and around Petra, some running along the walls of the sick at just above head height, some buried in the rock beneath the paving, some laid in channels cut along the tops of cliffs. Where the pipe had to cross open ground, it was often laid in a covered channel, and where it had to change elevation, small settling basins were built at the corners to slow the flow and to allow silt to drop out before it could clog the system. A single Nabatean engineer maintaining a line of pipe could clear it, one segment at a time, by pulling the pipes apart at the joints, cleaning them, and reseating them. The physics of these pipelines was surprisingly sophisticated. Recent studies by hydrologists have shown that the Nabatean engineers understood, at some intuitive level, the concept of hydraulic pressure. They designed their pipes so that the water inside them flowed at what modern engineers call subcritical velocity, which is to say slowly enough that turbulence would not damage the joints, and steadily enough that sediment would not accumulate. They calculated the gradient of their channels with remarkable accuracy, using drops of about 4% over long distances, which was gentle enough to prevent erosion of the interior surfaces, but steep enough to keep the water moving. In places where the ground rose between the source and the destination, they built inverted siphons, in which the pipeline dipped into a valley and then climbed the other side under pressure, using the weight of water in the descending arm to push water up the ascending arm. This technology existed in the Greek and Roman worlds too, but the Nabateans used it earlier and more elegantly than most of their neighbors, and they used it, again, in a landscape where it was much harder to build a solid pipe that could hold pressure without bursting. The final piece of the system was flood management. Petra sits at the meeting point of several wadis, and once or twice a winter, when the storms roll in from the west, those wadis can turn from dry stone into torrential brown rivers in a matter of minutes. A single flash flood can move boulders the size of houses. It can strip the topsoil from a field. It can drown a caravan. And it will do all of these things regardless of whether you have prepared for it. The Nabateans knew this because they had watched it happen for generations, and they had built their city in a place that was, from a naive point of view, one of the worst locations imaginable for a flood-prone civilization. The Sick itself is a flood channel. Every drop of water that falls on the high country to the east of Petra funnels down through that narrow crack in the mountain. And if the city had done nothing to divert it, the entire center of Petra would have been washed away several times a century, along with the market and the temples and everyone who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. What the Nabateans built to prevent that catastrophe is one of the most subtle pieces of hydraulic engineering in the ancient world. Just outside the modern eastern entrance to the city, at a place where the Wadi Musa comes down from the higher hills, they cut a great dam across the throat of the valley, and behind it, a diversion tunnel, some 80 meters long, drilled straight through the shoulder of a mountain. When the winter floods came, the water was blocked by the dam from entering the Sick. Instead, it was redirected through the tunnel into a neighboring valley called the Wadi al-Mudlim, where it could flow harmlessly away from the city. The engineering behind this was substantial. The tunnel had to be aligned exactly so that the water would enter it at the right angle and would not scour the entrance to failure. The dam had to be strong enough to hold against the flood peak, which could be violent, and had to include a spillway so that if the water did overtop the dam, it would do so in a controlled fashion. The system worked. For 400 years, it worked. It only stopped working when parts of it were damaged in a way we will come to shortly, and even then it continued in reduced form for centuries after. Alongside the flood diversion, the Nabateans built smaller check dams throughout the surrounding hills. A check dam is a low wall built across a wadi at intervals, not to store water so much as to slow it down. When rain comes rushing down a slope, a check dam catches it, holds it briefly, and forces it to drop the silt it is carrying. Behind each check dam, over the years, a small terrace of fertile soil accumulates, which can then be planted with crops. The Nabateans built thousands of these dams, and they turned the barren wadis around Petra into a network of small productive fields, growing barley and lentils and beans in a country where no field of grain had ever grown before. When the Greek geographer Strabo, writing at the beginning of the 1st century AD, described Petra to his readers in Rome, he mentioned that the Nabateans lived in a country of gardens, and archaeologists have often thought that this was an exaggeration by someone who had never been there. But recent excavations have shown that Strabo was right. Petra, in its heyday, was a green city in a red desert, its terraces heavy with vines, and its irrigation channels running clear. And the reason it was green was that its people had spent 500 years learning to catch and use every drop of water that fell within a day's walk of their doors. The garden complex near the great sanctuary that I mentioned in an earlier section fits into this system too. Aretas IV, and probably his son Malichus after him, built at the heart of the city a formal pleasure garden with fountains, a colonnaded pavilion, and an enormous rectangular pool nearly 40 meters across, filled with water fresh enough to keep fish alive in it. The pool was fed by a specific pipeline that ran all the way from a spring called Ain Musa several kilometers upstream, and it existed for no reason other than to be beautiful. In a desert. In a country that had rationed water for 1,000 years. It was the most extravagant possible statement of what Nabatean engineering could accomplish, which was, in effect, that the king of Petra could invite you to sit beside a pool of clean, cold water in the middle of the driest place you had ever seen, and you would understand, without a word being spoken, that his engineers were richer than gold. He sold the desert its own water at a very high markup, and he lived long enough to see the world admit that no one else could have done it. If you had walked into the city at the height of its wealth, sometime in the reign of Aretas IV or his son Malichus, and stood in the main plaza looking around, you would have seen a settlement that did not quite look like anywhere else in the world. It would have felt, to a Roman visitor, familiar in some ways. There were the colonnaded streets, the marble-clad fountains, the temples with their pediments and columns, the theatre cut into the mountain in the Greek fashion. To an Egyptian visitor, it would have felt familiar in other ways. The great tomb facades honoring the royal dead, the ritual importance of the mountain heights, the small stepped shrines to the gods carved on high places. To a merchant from India, it would have felt familiar in still other ways. The busy caravanserais, the perfume markets, the courtyards stacked with bales of goods. Petra sat at the crossing of civilizations, and it had drunk from all of them and stayed itself. Let me sketch, gently, what a single day looked like there, because to understand what was lost, we should first understand what was present. Imagine you are a Nabatean woman of about 30, born and raised in the city, living in a modest house of dressed stone and timber on a terraced slope above the main wadi, sometime around the year 25 AD. Your name is perhaps Shakalat, like the queen. You wake before dawn because the coolest hours are the best for work. Your house is built on a small platform of masonry cut back into the hillside, and its rooms open onto a small courtyard where a fig tree grows out of a bed of watered earth. A ceramic pipe, coming down from a shared cistern higher up the slope, feeds a small basin in one corner of the courtyard where you wash your face. Your children are still asleep on their pallets. You take a fresh flatbread from the covered basket on the shelf, dip it in olive oil pressed from trees that grow in the hills 2 days' walk from here, and eat it standing in the courtyard while you listen to the city wake up. The sounds are particular. The first sound is water, because water in Petra is never quiet. Somewhere in the walls behind you the pipes are running, and from further down the slope you can hear the small trickle of a public fountain that never turns off. Then the animals. Camels grunting at the caravan camps outside the eastern gate, donkeys braying on the way to market, the sudden bark of a household dog. Then the human sounds, a neighbor sweeping a threshold, a grandmother scolding a child, a trader calling out the price of dates in Aramaic with a laugh that carries across the wadi. And then, as the sun clears the eastern ridge and floods the cliffs opposite your courtyard with sudden red light, you hear the distant chant of the priests at the great temple of Dashara, greeting the day with a prayer as old as the mountain. You dress in a long tunic of woven linen, dyed a soft red with madder root that came in a caravan from the east 6 months ago. You pin the shoulder with a bronze brooch worked in the pattern the local silversmiths favor, a rosette inside a circle. Your hair is bound up under cloth for the day's work. You have some money in a small pouch at your belt, real coined money, silver drachmas, stamped with the face of the king, because Petra by now runs on coin the way it once ran on barter, and every household of any standing keeps a little on hand. You wake your children, feed them, send the older one down the terrace to the school where a Nabatean scribe teaches the sons of merchants to read Aramaic and to do the arithmetic they will need later in life. Girls do not go to that school. The daughters of the town learn their letters at home if they learn them at all, from their mothers, and you had a mother who taught you, and so your daughter will learn from you. You go to the market. The main market of Petra ran along the colonnaded street, in a series of stalls under the covered porticos where the shade was always deep. You pass under an arch, greet the man at the customs post who knows your family, and step into a river of noise and smell. Perfumers first. Whole shops given over to the frankincense and myrrh and cinnamon and cassia, and nard that pass through the city in enormous quantities, most of it bound for foreign temples, but some kept back for local use. A pinch of myrrh for a mother in mourning, a lump of frankincense for the household altar. Cloth merchants next. Bolts of Egyptian linen, bright as milk. Rolls of Chinese silk that has traveled overland for a year to arrive here, whispered against by pilgrims who cannot afford it and by nobles who can. Purple wool from Tyre, its dye extracted drop by drop from a certain sea snail, so precious that a single robe of it costs more than a laborer's yearly wages. Dyestuffs, spices, dried herbs, perfumed oils in small ceramic bottles from Egypt, sealed with wax and stamped with the maker's mark. You buy what you need, a packet of cumin, a twist of the dried mint the Highlanders grow, a small clay jar of honey from the beekeepers of the Shara. You haggle, it is expected. The seller expects it and takes offense if you accept the first price he names. Beyond the market, if you continue down the paved street, you come to the civic center. Here the atmosphere shifts. The chatter of the market dies down, and you move among Nabateans in their finer robes, priests and merchants and officials, and among foreigners of every kind. Roman legionaries on leave from the garrison at Bostra, up in Syria, come to see the famous city. Jewish traders from Jerusalem in for the perfume trade. Greek philosophers, occasionally, who have made the journey to see for themselves the country the geographers have written about. Egyptian caravan masters, tall men with long white robes, waiting in the shade for the king's officials to sign their tax documents. Arabs from the deep south, from the incense country itself, who have made the whole journey up with their bales and now stand blinking in the strange, bright plaza of the northern capital, hearing their own language spoken in the accents of another region. Petra is a Babel, and its lingua franca is Aramaic, though Greek is used for foreign correspondence, and every scribe worth his fee can handle both. You climb the steps of the great sanctuary and enter the courtyard, where an attendant washes your hands with a small pitcher of water because you cannot approach the god unwashed. The temple itself is built rather than carved, dressed limestone blocks fitted together, faced with plaster and painted in bright colors. Inside the sanctuary, the god Dashara is not represented as a person. Nabatean religion did not much like figured representations of its gods, in the way the Jews of the same period did not much like them either. The god is a stone, a block of dressed rock, sometimes called a betel, standing on an altar in the inner chamber, and understood by every Nabatean who kneels before it to be the presence of the god concentrated into a form that can be seen and touched, but not carved into a likeness. You do not enter the inner chamber. Only priests may. You stand in the outer courtyard. You make your offering, a small cake of barley and oil and honey that you have brought from home, and you leave your prayer on the wind. Health for your children, safe travel for your husband, who is with a caravan somewhere beyond Damascus and will not be home until the autumn. You leave the sanctuary and walk back down the main street. The heat is rising now. In the shaded arcades along the colonnade, water sellers move with jars on their hips, selling ladles of cool water for a small copper coin. You buy one, drink it, and marvel, as your grandmother taught you to marvel, that you have just paid a fraction of a drachma for a cup of water in a country where 100 generations ago a cup of water was worth a day's labor. In the middle of the plaza, a slave boy of the city administration is filling a stone basin from a pipe that runs down from the great cistern under the theater, and camels from an incoming caravan are being watered from it. The water is clear. It has come by pipe and channel through a system some 500 years old and still working perfectly from a spring 7 kilometers away. You pass the theater. There is no performance today. There often are in the season. Traveling companies of Greek actors, who follow the caravan routes as reliably as the traders do, come to Petra every year with new plays and old, and the seats fill with a mixed audience of Nabateans and foreigners, watching in the peculiar acoustics of a theater cut into rock, where the actor's voice carries perfectly to the highest row without amplification. When the plays are not on, the theater is used for civic assemblies. The elders of the city meet there in the cool of the evening to discuss the questions that need discussing: the condition of the water system, the rate of the market tolls, the complaints of the caravan masters about the tariffs on silk, the question, in this particular decade, of what to do about the Romans, who have annexed the province of Judea just to the west, and whose legionaries can now be seen more and more often on the roads to the north. You go home. Your daughter is back from her lesson. Your son is home from school and is asking whether he can go up the 800 steps to the monastery tomorrow with the other boys because there is a festival there. You say yes, because you remember when you used to make that climb yourself. You cook. Lentils, mostly, with a little mutton for the flavor and a lot of bread. You eat as the sun goes down and the cliffs opposite your courtyard turn from red to violet to a deep glowing purple that fades to grey. Lamps come out in the windows across the wadi. Somewhere down in the city, a musician is playing a reed pipe. Your husband is not home. Your children are half asleep in your lap. The great civilization around you at this precise moment is functioning perfectly. The pipes are full. The cisterns are topped up. The caravans are moving. The king is on his throne. The god is in his stone. And nowhere on the horizon can you see the trouble that is coming, though it is already coming, quietly, in the form of small policy decisions being made in Rome by men who have never heard of you. Rome had been watching Petra for a long time before it decided to do anything about it. This is worth understanding, because the fall of the Nabatean kingdom was not a violent conquest in the ordinary sense. There was no legendary siege, no burning of a city, no line of kings marched in chains through a triumphal arch in the Forum. When the end came, in the year 106 AD, it came so quietly that the Roman historians of the period barely mention it, and the archaeological record of the city itself shows no destruction layer, no burning, no massacre. 1 year Petra was the capital of an independent kingdom that had lasted more than 400 years. The next year it was a city in a Roman province, and its king was gone, and no one, so far as we can tell, made any particular fuss about it. To understand how that happened, we need to walk backward a little from the year 106 and see what had been changing in the world. For most of the reign of Aretas IV, the relationship between the Nabateans and the Romans had been a careful and profitable partnership. Rome needed the frankincense trade, and Rome could not run it. The Roman Empire under Augustus and his successors was fabulously wealthy, hungry for Eastern luxuries, and utterly dependent on the caravan cities of the Near East to bring those luxuries within reach. Palmyra, out in the Syrian desert, ran one branch of the great trade. Petra ran the southern branch. Both cities paid tribute to Rome in their fashion, provided troops when asked, offered hospitality to Roman officials, and were left largely alone to manage their own affairs. The arrangement worked because it was cheaper for Rome to buy cooperation than to buy conquest. A legion stationed in the desert costs money to feed. A local king managing the desert on your behalf costs nothing and pays you tribute besides. But two developments, both slow, were about to break the model. The first was that Rome had discovered a shortcut. Sometime in the middle of the 1st century AD, Greek and Roman sailors, operating out of the Red Sea ports of Egypt, learned to use the seasonal monsoon winds that blow across the Indian Ocean. They learned that if you set out from Egypt in the summer, the monsoon will carry your ship in a matter of weeks all the way to the coast of India, and if you wait until winter, the reversed monsoon will bring you home. This was a piece of navigational knowledge that Arab and Indian sailors had possessed for centuries, and the Nabateans had known about it too, but had kept the information as quiet as possible, because the moment Roman ships could sail directly to India, the overland caravan trade began to lose its point. Why buy pepper from a Nabatean middleman in Petra when your own ships could load it in an Indian port and bring it to Alexandria in half the time and at a third of the price? By the reign of Aratus the Fourth's grandson, the Roman geographers were writing detailed handbooks about the Indian Ocean routes, listing the ports, the winds, the goods available at each, and the local customs. The book we have from this period, called The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, is an extraordinary document, essentially a merchant's manual for global trade, and it makes barely any mention of Petra at all. The city was becoming, from the point of view of Roman commerce, redundant. The second development was that Rome had grown tired of its own success. In the days when the empire was still expanding, it had been happy to keep client kingdoms as buffers along its edges. But by the 2nd century, Rome had reached the practical limits of expansion, and its administrators were increasingly interested in tidying up the empire's borders and simplifying its administration. A patchwork of small dependent kingdoms was harder to govern than a single directly administered province. Client kings had to be managed, humored, courted, and occasionally punished. A Roman procurator, appointed for a set term and paid a set salary, was easier to control. Across the eastern frontier, one by one, the client kingdoms were being absorbed. Judea was annexed in 6 AD. Commagene, up in southern Turkey, was absorbed in 72 AD. Palmyra, further north, was allowed to keep the appearance of independence, but was more and more tightly integrated into the Roman military system. By the time the Emperor Trajan came to the throne in 98 AD, the Nabatean kingdom was one of the last significant independent states left in the region, and Trajan was a man whose interest in tidying up his empire ran deep. The last king of Nabatea was named Rabble II, and he ruled for about 36 years, from 70 to 106 AD. On his coins he called himself, "He who brings life and salvation to his people," which was, in the circumstances, either a proud claim or a slightly desperate one. He was a competent monarch. He moved his capital, or at least his official residence, from Petra north to the city of Bosra, in what is now southern Syria, probably because Bosra sat on newer trade routes that were still active while Petra's routes were bleeding away. He built extensively. He renovated the water systems. He minted coins in his mother's name as well as his own, which was a way of shoring up his family's political legitimacy. And he seems, from the archaeological record, to have managed a peaceful and prosperous reign, even as the underlying economics of his kingdom slowly turned against him. When he died, without a clear adult male heir who could hold the throne, the moment Rome had been waiting for arrived. What happened next is not entirely clear, because our sources are thin. A Roman historian named Cassius Dio, writing a century later, mentions the annexation of Nabatea in a single line, which is roughly the same amount of attention he gives to the paving of a road. What we know is that in the year 106 AD, a Roman governor of Syria named Cornelius Palma led a force south into Nabatean territory, and that the kingdom passed into Roman hands as the new province of Arabia Petrea, meaning Arabia of the Rock. There is no mention of a battle. There is no mention of a siege. There is no mention of resistance. It is possible that Rabble II had already made arrangements before his death for a peaceful transfer, either as the price of protecting his family or because he had come to accept the inevitability of it. It is also possible that the Nabatean elite, faced with a succession crisis and a slowly declining economy, made their own calculation and concluded that being a Roman province with intact trade privileges was better than being an independent kingdom that could no longer defend those privileges. Whatever the mechanism, the transition was smooth. The coins of Petra were replaced with coins bearing the image of Trajan. The Roman legion known as the Third Cyrenaica moved into Bosra and set up its headquarters. Roman road engineers began surveying a new highway, the Via Nova Traiana, which would run from the northern city of Bosra all the way south to the port of Aila on the Red Sea, passing through the Nabatean heartland along the way. The road was completed in 111 AD, 5 years after annexation. It is still there in places. You can walk on stretches of Roman paving today. At first, the change in status probably felt, to most Nabateans, like a change of stationery rather than a change of civilization. Their language, Aramaic, was still spoken in the streets. Their gods, Dashara and Al-Azhar and the others, were still worshipped in the temples. Their tombs still lined the cliffs. Their pipelines still ran. Their coins were now Roman, but coins had always come and gone. Petra was even honored with the Roman title of metropolis, which was a way of acknowledging that it was, by ancient standards, an important city. Trajan's successor, Hadrian, visited the region in 130 AD and gave Petra his own name for a while, so that its official designation became Hadrian Petra Metropolis, and a few inscriptions from this period preserve the phrase. On the surface, it looked as though the city had made the transition intact. But underneath the surface, the slow bleed had already begun. The caravan trade continued, but at reduced volume, because more and more of the eastern goods were coming by sea. The Roman authorities were happy to have Petra as an administrative center, but they preferred Bosra as their military base, and Bosra grew while Petra did not. Roman trade preferences favored other cities. Palmyra, in particular, boomed in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, becoming for a while one of the richest cities in the Eastern Empire, precisely because it lay on routes that were still overland and still viable. Petra's routes were the ones the ships had made obsolete. The city adapted, as cities do. It stopped being primarily a caravan hub and became more of a regional center. Its markets were smaller but still busy. Its population at its Roman peak may have reached 30,000, which was still enormous for that country. Its temples remained active. New buildings appeared in a more thoroughly Roman style than before. The great colonnaded street was refurbished with monumental arches. The theater was expanded. A large temple complex, sometimes identified as the Great Temple, was elaborated with new courtyards and columns. If you had walked through Petra in the year 200 AD, you would have found a city that looked much like it had looked in the year 20 AD, only with fewer camels in the caravan camps outside the gate, and a scattering of Roman legionaries in the barracks, and Roman street signs, and altars alongside the older Nabatean ones. The population went about its business. Children played in the shadow of the treasury. Water flowed through the pipes. The god Dashara, or perhaps by now more often his Roman-faced Ducias, still received his offerings. And then, in the 4th century, two things happened almost at the same time, and between them they broke the back of the city. The first was that the empire itself changed religion. In 313 AD, the Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity, and over the next century, the old gods of the Mediterranean, including the Nabatean gods who had blended with them, were slowly displaced from the public life of the cities. Petra had a bishop by the 4th century. Its temples were closed, or converted, or simply abandoned. The stone image of Dashara that had stood at the center of the great sanctuary for 4 centuries was quietly retired, and no one recorded what happened to it. A basilica was built. The city was no longer, in any spiritual sense, the city the Nabateans had built. The second thing that happened, and it happened on a specific day, was the earthquake of the year 363, and it is that earthquake, and what it did to the water system, that we should turn to next. The morning of May 19, in the year 363, began ordinarily. This we know because a letter survives from a bishop named Cyril, writing to a colleague about events in Jerusalem, and he mentions in passing that just before noon, the ground shook violently across the entire region, from Palestine down through the desert to Petra and beyond. Cyril was mainly interested in Jerusalem and in a rebuilding project at the Temple Mount that the earthquake had interrupted, and he does not tell us much about Petra directly. But the archaeological record of the city itself tells us the rest, and it tells us in vivid, terrible detail. There is a destruction layer at Petra dating precisely to this earthquake, and it is the first destruction layer the city had ever suffered in more than 5 centuries of existence. Roofs collapsed. Walls fell. The great columns of the colonnaded street snapped at their bases and fell in a domino line across the paving, where several of them still lie today, exactly where they fell, waiting for someone to come and pick them up who never did. The theatre cracked. Portions of the great temple were reduced to rubble. The upper floors of many of the tombs and rock-cut chambers, especially those with less structural rock supporting them, sheared off and crashed down into the wadi below. But the buildings could have been rebuilt. The buildings had been rebuilt before, after smaller shocks, and the Nabatean and later Roman engineers were perfectly capable of stacking up columns and mortaring walls back into place. What could not be rebuilt easily was the water system. The pipelines, buried in the rock or laid along cliff faces, had been designed to be very slightly flexible, but they had not been designed for the whole mountain to jump beneath them. When the earthquake came, the ceramic pipes snapped at the joints, in some places by the hundreds. Whole sections of pipeline slid down slopes. The great flood diversion dam at the entrance to the sick cracked and shifted. The tunnel through the mountain shoulder partially collapsed at one end. The cisterns, some of which had been full when the shock came, split their walls and drained into the surrounding rock. And most terribly of all, the springs themselves, whose flow had been reliable for centuries because of the particular geometry of the underground fissures that fed them, changed. Some sprang up in new places, some dried entirely. The great spring of Ain Musa still flowed, but it flowed differently, and the elaborate system of channels that had been designed to catch it and carry it to the city had to be entirely re-engineered from the ground up. The people of Petra did what they could. There is evidence, in the layers above the destruction, of substantial rebuilding in the decades after 363. Some of the pipelines were repaired. Some of the cisterns were sealed and put back into service. Sections of the paved main street were relaid, though not to the standard of the original work. The bishop's basilica was built or expanded in the 5th century, and grand mosaic floors were laid in it, some of which have been recovered by archaeologists and are of considerable beauty. Petra in the 5th and 6th centuries was still a city. It was still inhabited by thousands of people. It was still an administrative center of the Byzantine province of Palestina Tertia, the third of the 3 subdivisions of what had once been the Roman province of Palestine. It still had markets. It still had churches. There is even evidence that some of the old rock-cut tombs were converted into Christian chapels, with crosses carved over the older Nabatean symbols, and hermits and monks moved into the emptier upper caves for solitary contemplation. If you had walked through the ruins in the year 500, you would have found a diminished but still functioning town, its population perhaps a third of what it had once been, its ambitions modest, its energies spent on making do with the water it could still gather. Then a second earthquake struck in the year 551, and a third in the middle of the 7th century, and each one broke a little more of what was left, and each time the reconstruction was less thorough, because there were fewer hands and less money to do the work. And around and behind these physical disasters, the political landscape of the whole region was being reshuffled in ways that would leave Petra permanently marginal. In the year 630s, the armies of the new Islamic Caliphate swept out of Arabia and took possession of the entire Near East in an astonishingly short time. The Byzantine armies were defeated. The old provincial administrations dissolved. Damascus became the capital of a new empire that stretched, within a century, from Spain to the borders of India. And in that reshaped world, Petra was simply not on the map. The new caravan routes ran east and west between Damascus and Baghdad, or south from Damascus through Medina to Mecca. The old north-south incense route was long dead. The Red Sea shipping lanes, which had been eating Petra's trade for centuries, now carried the pilgrims of the new faith to and from the holy cities of Arabia. Petra had nothing left to sell that anyone still wanted to buy in a location that was no longer on the way to anywhere. The people did not so much leave as fade. It was gradual. A merchant's family, one generation, decided to move to Damascus, where the money was. A farming family, the next generation, decided to move to a village up the valley, where the water was still reliable. The bishop's seat was moved elsewhere. The garrison, if there had ever really been one after the earlier centuries, was withdrawn. The churches were closed for lack of a congregation. The last recorded Christian bishop of Petra dates from the 6th century, and after that the ecclesiastical records go silent. By the year 800, perhaps a few hundred people were still living in the ruins, mostly Bedouin who had adapted the ancient rock-cut tombs into shelters for themselves and their animals. By the year 1000, even those were gone from the central city, though nomads still passed through the region seasonally, watering their flocks at the surviving springs and telling their children stories about the strange carved facades and the ghosts of the old kings. When the Crusaders arrived in the region in the 12th century, they knew about Petra, or at least about a fortress in that area, which they called Sela, from an Old Testament name for a rocky place in the region. They built two small castles nearby, at Al-Wadra and at Al-Habis, using the natural cliffs for their walls and cutting new chambers where they needed them. They held these forts for perhaps 60 years, and then they were driven out by the armies of Saladin, and their castles fell into ruin in their turn. But even the Crusaders do not seem to have really understood what Petra had been. They saw carved facades in the cliffs and assumed they were natural formations. They did not identify the site as the ancient city of the Nabateans. That identification had been lost. The name Petra, in its Greek and Latin form, had disappeared from active use, and the memory of what had happened there had gone with it. In the libraries of Europe, the city existed only as a name in old geographies, mentioned by Strabo and Pliny and other classical writers, with rough indications of where it might have been, but without any living knowledge of whether it still stood or what it looked like. For 600 years, from roughly the 12th century until the early 19th, no European visitor to the Near East made it to Petra and identified it as Petra. The site was known to the local Bedouin tribes, who had names for its various features, but they had no reason to advertise its existence to outsiders, and they had strong reasons not to. The tombs and chambers of the old city were widely believed by the local population to contain hidden treasure. The pharaoh who had, in the local legend, hidden his gold in the urn on the top of the treasury facade, had also, in the same legend, hidden other treasures in other places throughout the ruins, and any outsider who came asking questions about the place was assumed to be a treasure hunter, and to have designs on wealth that the Bedouin considered rightfully their own. Furthermore, one particular shrine on a mountain above the city, known as the Tomb of Aaron, the brother of Moses, was considered sacred by the local Muslims. It stood on the highest peak in the region, on a mountain called by the Arabs Jabal Haran, meaning Mount Aaron, and pilgrims visited it, and the surrounding country was under the protection of the local tribe, who guarded the shrine and expected respect for it. Any European Christian who came prying, without a good reason and without local protection, could expect at best to be turned back, and at worst to be robbed and possibly killed. So Petra sat, through the whole long sleep of 6 centuries, empty and unforgotten only by the tribes who lived beside it. The pipes were dry. The cisterns held rainwater when it rained and lay dusty when it did not. The tombs stood, quietly, some empty, some still containing the bones of Nabateans whom no one alive could name. The treasury still faced the small square at the end of the sick, its urn still atop its pediment, patiently accumulating the marks of casual gunfire from generation after generation of hopeful shepherds who thought there might, after all, be gold inside. The great theatre still held its rows of seats. The paved main street still lay under a slow accumulation of blown sand, and the fallen columns of that street still lay across the paving, and no one lifted them, because no one who lived nearby had any use for them. The city dreamed is perhaps the only honest way to say it. It dreamed of caravans it no longer received, and of kings it no longer had, and of a language it no longer heard spoken in its streets, and the wind moved through the empty chambers at night and made a sound that the Bedouin, camping outside, said was the ghosts talking. And then in the summer of 1812, A young Swiss traveler in Arab dress rode down out of the northern hills toward the ruins, and he had a story ready. And he was about to become the first European in 600 years to walk into Petra and know exactly what he was looking at. His name was Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, and he was 27 years old. He had been born in the Swiss city of Lausanne into a well-off family, and he had studied at Cambridge, and he had, some years earlier, made a bargain with a London society devoted to the exploration of Africa. They would fund him. He would go to the Near East, learn Arabic thoroughly, disguise himself as a Muslim scholar, and eventually attempt to cross the Sahara from the north. That was the long plan. The Petra encounter was, in his own mind, an incidental detour along the way. To prepare for the great journey, he had spent nearly 3 years living in Aleppo and Damascus, working on his Arabic until it was indistinguishable from that of a native scholar, growing his beard, adopting local dress, and slowly building up the persona he would inhabit for the rest of his short life. He called himself Sheikh Ibrahim ibn Abdullah. He said he was a Muslim from India, which was clever because his accent would not match that of any local Arab. But any local Arab could plausibly believe that a Muslim from a distant country would sound the way he sounded. He carried nothing on his person that could have identified him as a European. His only European possession, when he traveled through dangerous country, was a small compass hidden in the folds of his robe, and even that he would produce only when he was certain of privacy. By the summer of 1812, he had learned enough and traveled enough to make his way alone through Syria and down into what is now Jordan. He was heading for Cairo, from which he intended to launch his African journey. His route took him through the mountains east of the Dead Sea. And in that region he had heard, from the Arabs he traveled with, persistent rumors of the ruins of an old city hidden in a valley of red cliffs to the south of the modern town of Wadi Musa. The ruins, they said, were extensive. There were carved fronts on the mountainsides. There were caves with columns and painted ceilings. No stranger was allowed to visit them without local escort, and even with escort, the tribes were suspicious. Burckhardt read what he could find in his memory of the classical geographers about the location of Petra, and he compared it to what he was hearing, and he became quietly convinced that the two were the same place, and that if he could contrive to visit the site, he would be recovering for European scholarship, a city that had been lost for 600 years. The contrivance he devised is one of the most beautiful pieces of ordinary human ingenuity in the history of exploration. He could not simply announce that he wanted to see the ruins. That would immediately mark him as a Frank, meaning a European, meaning a treasure hunter, and would guarantee that he was either turned back or robbed. He could not travel with an army of servants, because Sheikh Ibrahim ibn Abdullah was a modest scholar, not a rich man. He needed a reason to visit that region which any local Muslim would find not merely acceptable but praiseworthy, and that reason, he knew, existed. On the peak of Jabal Haran, Mount Aaron, above the ruins, stood the tomb of Aaron, the brother of Moses, revered by Muslims as a prophet. A pious pilgrim making his way through the region might reasonably wish to visit that shrine, and might reasonably vow to sacrifice a goat there in fulfillment of a personal vow to God. Nothing about that vow would strike anyone in the region as strange. Every year, a small trickle of pilgrims made exactly such vows and traveled exactly such routes. Burckhardt would be simply one more. So he stopped in the village of Elgi, which is the modern town of Wadi Musa at the eastern edge of the ancient city, and he introduced himself as Sheikh Ibrahim, and he explained that he had made a vow before God to sacrifice a goat at the shrine of the prophet Haran, and that he needed a guide to take him to the mountain. He purchased a goat in the village. He engaged a Bedouin man of the local tribe as his guide. He paid, but not so much as to raise suspicion. And on the morning of August 22, 1812, he set out from Elgi with his guide, leading the goat on a rope, walking down into the country that no European had knowingly entered since the last of the Crusader garrisons had been driven out in the 12th century. The way in, of course, went through the sick. Burckhardt walked down that narrow canyon between its towering red walls, holding his goat, playing the part of the pious pilgrim, and taking in with the corner of his eye everything he could see without seeming to look. He noted the water channels along the cliff faces. He noted the ceramic pipe. He noted the small carved niches with their weathered figures. He noted, without exclaiming, that the paving beneath his feet was the work of skilled ancient hands. His guide, a man of the local Liathna tribe, walked ahead of him and paid no particular attention, because a pilgrim ought to be moved by the landscape. Then they came around the last curve, and in the narrow slice of view between the closing walls of the sick, the great pink facade of the treasury appeared, precisely as it had appeared to every visitor for 2,000 years, and Burckhardt saw it, and understood immediately what he was seeing, and had to school his face very carefully so that his guide would not notice the shock of recognition on it. He was a European scholar. He had read Vitruvius. He had read Strabo. He was standing in front of a Greco-Roman monumental tomb of the 1st century, carved into a cliff in a country where no such monument was supposed to exist. He knew at once that Petra had been rediscovered. He also knew that if he showed the slightest sign of that knowledge, if he took out a sketchbook, if he asked too many questions, if he lingered too long, his guide would become suspicious and would report to the tribe that this pilgrim was in fact a treasure hunter, and everything would come apart. So Burckhardt did the hardest thing an explorer has ever had to do in the presence of a great discovery. He walked past. He glanced at the treasury with the mild interest of a pilgrim noticing something curious on his way to prayer, and he walked on into the wider valley, past the street of facades, past the theatre, past the royal tombs, past the great temple, past the pool of Aretas, the 4th long since drained and half filled with sand, past every one of the miracles that had made the ancient city famous, and he took mental notes. He counted things. He measured with his eye. He memorized the shape of the columns and the arrangement of the tombs. His guide urged him along toward the mountain, and Burckhardt allowed himself to be urged, because to linger would have destroyed the whole expedition. When the guide, growing suspicious of his long looks, muttered that these old ruins were the work of infidels and no proper concern of a Muslim pilgrim, Burckhardt murmured pieties and pushed on. They climbed Jabal Haran. It was late in the day by the time they reached the shrine. Burckhardt sacrificed his goat. He said the prayers. He observed the rituals. And then, because it was late, and because he could plausibly claim exhaustion, he allowed his guide to lead him back down by a shorter path that skipped most of the ruins, and he emerged from Petra with his cover intact, and with a discovery in his notebook that would eventually redraw the archaeological map of the ancient world. That evening, back in his lodgings in Elgee, he wrote in his journal in French so that no local reader could understand it if the notebook was seen. He described what he had glimpsed. He recorded his belief that the ruins were the ancient city of Petra, capital of the Nabateans, lost to European knowledge for 600 years. He noted, with the calm of a scholar, that a proper survey of the site would require months of work and a level of security that no single traveler could arrange. He did not know that he had rediscovered one of the wonders of the ancient world. He suspected it. He put the notebook away, and the next morning he left Elgee and continued his journey toward Cairo. Burckhardt himself never returned to Petra. He spent the remaining 5 years of his life in Cairo, still in his Sheikh Ibrahim persona, working on his Arabic, exploring the Nile, making a pilgrimage to Mecca, which he successfully completed, becoming one of the first Europeans to see the interior of the great mosque there. He was preparing to at last set out on the African journey that had been his original mission, when, in the year 1817, at the age of 32, he fell ill with dysentery in Cairo and died. He was buried in the Muslim cemetery of that city under his adopted name, and his tombstone still stands there, with an inscription in Arabic calling him Sheikh Ibrahim, servant of God. The London society that had funded him received his journals after his death and published them, and the entries about Petra caused a quiet sensation in the small world of European scholarship. Within a decade, other travelers were making their way to the site, some in disguise, some with substantial armed escorts, and slowly, over the course of the 19th century, the ruins were surveyed and drawn and photographed, and eventually, in the 20th century, properly excavated. Every one of them followed Burckhardt in through the sick. Every one of them saw the treasury emerge from between the cliffs. And every one of them owed the possibility of that vision to a young Swiss traveler who had led a goat down that canyon and pretended not to be amazed. The city he rediscovered is still there tonight. It is a tourist site now, one of the most visited archaeological sites in the world, and its Bedouin custodians, descendants of the tribes who guarded it in Burckhardt's time, still work in the ruins, leading visitors through the tombs and pointing out the marks of the ancient masons. The pipes are dry. The cisterns hold rainwater when it rains and lie dusty when it does not, and their empty basins wait politely, as they have waited for 1600 years, for a flood that never quite fills them the way it used to. The treasury still faces its little square. The urn at the top of its facade still bears the pockmarks of hopeful gunfire, and it is still, as it always was, solid stone. The masons who carved it are long gone. The kings who paid them are long gone. The caravans they served are long gone. But the mountain remembers in the only way stone can remember, which is by holding the shape that was cut into it and by refusing to forget. The story of Petra is a story about patience. The patience of a people who learned to wait for the rain. The patience of a king who waited 9 years to answer an insult. The patience of masons who dangled from ropes for a lifetime, carving down through a cliff toward a ground they might never see finished. The patience of a city that slept, empty, for 600 years, its water waiting in its cisterns, its stones waiting in the sun, until finally a traveler came who knew what he was looking at. And now, gently, let it be patience for you too. There is no more canyon to walk through tonight. The treasury is behind us. The sick is behind us. The desert is quiet, and the wind has stopped, and every cistern in Petra is full of the same darkness that is filling your room. If you are still awake, you do not have to be. Another journey is waiting whenever you want it, and it will keep. If tonight's walk carried you somewhere good, you can leave a like on the video and subscribe, or drop a thought in the comments, and it will be read in the morning. But that is tomorrow's business. For now, let your body sink a little heavier into the bed. Unclench your jaw. Let your breathing slow down all on its own. Close your eyes and let the sound of the caravans fade. Sleep is a kind of homecoming too, and yours is right here. Good night and sweet dreams.